Rowan Callahan had always been known for her love of the ocean. Her life revolved around the waters of Charleston, South Carolina, where she spent her days as a marine biologist dedicated to the preservation of marine ecosystems. Her wedding to Declan Pierce, a charismatic IT consultant, was a celebration of love and shared dreams. The ceremony took place in an elegant coastal venue, blending Rowan's passion for the sea with Declan's charm and sophistication. Friends and family marveled at the couple's chemistry, certain they were destined for a long and happy life together. The honeymoon was a natural extension of their shared vision, a 7-day Caribbean cruise aboard the Emerald Horizon. Rowan had planned the trip meticulously, choosing a luxurious itinerary that included snorkeling in turquoise waters and exploring hidden coves. For Declan, it was the perfect way to unwind after the chaos of wedding preparations. The cruise promised sun-drenched days and star-filled nights, an idyllic start to their married life. As they boarded the Emerald Horizon, Rowan was captivated by the ship's grandeur. The sprawling decks, glittering chandeliers, and endless views of the open sea seemed like the embodiment of her dreams. Declan's excitement was more subdued, though he indulged her enthusiasm with a warm smile and a reassuring hand on her back. The couple settled into their suite, which boasted a private balcony overlooking the ocean. It was everything Rowan had hoped for, a haven of tranquility and romance. The first few days of the cruise were a whirlwind of activities. Rowan delighted in the vibrant underwater world during snorkeling excursions, while Declan enjoyed lounging on the deck with a cocktail in hand. In the evenings, they dined at the ship's upscale restaurants, savoring fine cuisine and clinking glasses to their future. Rowan posted photos of sunsets and sparkling waters on social media, a testament to their seemingly perfect honeymoon. But beneath the surface, cracks had already begun to form. Declan's mood shifts were subtle at first, moments of impatience or distraction that Rowan attributed to fatigue. On the third evening, he disappeared for nearly an hour after dinner, returning with a vague excuse about needing fresh air. Rowan didn't press him, unwilling to disrupt the harmony she was determined to maintain. She convinced herself that it was simply the stress of the wedding lingering in his mind. By the fourth day, Rowan began to notice other signs. Declan seemed restless, pacing their suite when he thought she wasn't looking. At dinner that night, he was unusually quiet, his responses clipped and distant. Rowan tried to engage him, but her attempts were met with a strained smile and a dismissive wave of his hand. The atmosphere between them grew tense, a sharp contrast to the laughter and music that filled the dining room around them. That evening, Declan suggested they skip the show scheduled in the ship's theater and retire early. Rowan agreed, hoping some time alone would help ease the tension. As they returned to their suite, she caught a glimpse of something in Declan's hand, a small, inconspicuous pouch that he quickly slipped into his pocket. Her curiosity was piqued, but she chose not to mention it. Instead, she resolved to address her concerns later, after they had both had a chance to relax. As Rowan prepared for bed, Declan stepped onto the balcony, the faint glow of a cigarette illuminating his silhouette against the dark expanse of the ocean. The sight unsettled her. Declan rarely smoked, and when he did, it was usually a sign of stress. Rowan decided she couldn't ignore the growing unease any longer. She resolved to speak with him in the morning, certain they could work through whatever was troubling him. The night passed quietly, but Rowan's mind raced with unanswered questions. She replayed the events of the past few days, searching for clues to Declan's behavior. As dawn broke over the horizon, she watched the first rays of sunlight dance on the water, hoping the new day would bring clarity. Unbeknownst to her, the cracks in their perfect facade were about to deepen. The idyllic honeymoon they had dreamed of was on the verge of unraveling, setting the stage for a series of events that would forever alter the lives of everyone aboard the Emerald Horizon. Rowan could never have imagined that within the coming days, her life would be reduced to a haunting mystery, one that would grip the nation and reveal the darkness lurking beneath her husband's charming exterior. The morning after the unsettling evening, the cruise ship was alive with activity. Guests flooded the dining areas, enjoying lavish breakfast spreads and planning their excursions for the day. Rowan Callahan, however, felt a sense of unease. Declan's mood had remained distant, his usual charm replaced with a cold detachment. He had barely spoken a word during breakfast, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if avoiding her gaze. Rowan tried to push aside her discomfort. She reminded herself that marriage brought new challenges, and perhaps this was simply a temporary adjustment. They had spent so much time planning the wedding and preparing for this trip that exhaustion was bound to take its toll. She decided to focus on the day ahead, which promised snorkeling at a nearby coral reef and a private sunset dinner on the deck. The itinerary was designed to rekindle their connection, but Rowan couldn't shake the growing sense that something intangible was slipping away. As they disembarked for the snorkeling excursion, Rowan noticed Declan lingering behind. He claimed he had forgotten something in the suite and would join her shortly. She nodded, assuming it was nothing out of the ordinary, and boarded the tender boat with the other passengers. The turquoise waters and vibrant marine life offered a welcome distraction, and for a while she allowed herself to revel in the beauty surrounding her. But Declan never arrived. When Rowan returned to the ship in the early afternoon, she found him sitting on the balcony, a drink in hand. His posture was tense and the lines on his face seemed deeper than she remembered. He offered no explanation for his absence, brushing off her concern with a vague mention of feeling unwell. Rowan didn't press further, though the knot in her stomach tightened. Something was clearly wrong, but she couldn't pinpoint what. By evening, the tension between them had become palpable. Rowan dressed carefully for their private dinner, hoping to rekindle the spark that had seemed so effortless just days ago. Declan, however, appeared distracted, his attention wandering as they were seated at an intimate table overlooking the ocean. The soft glow of candlelight and the rhythmic sound of the waves did little to ease the growing distance between them. Throughout the meal, Declan's behavior grew more erratic. He fidgeted with his utensils, his eyes darting toward the nearby bar as though seeking something or someone. When Rowan reached for his hand, he pulled away abruptly, muttering an apology that felt rehearsed. It was clear to Rowan that his mind was elsewhere, though he refused to admit it. The conversation between them became stilted, with long silences punctuated by forced attempts at small talk. As the evening wore on, Rowan's patience began to wane. Declan excused himself multiple times, each absence growing longer than the last. When he finally returned, his pupils were dilated and his movements seemed jittery. Rowan's heart sank as realization began to dawn. The signs had been subtle at first: the restless pacing, the sudden absences, the pouch she had glimpsed in his hand. Declan was using drugs. It wasn't something she had ever imagined would touch her life. Declan had always presented himself as the picture of composure, a man who valued control and discipline. But now, the man sitting across from her was a shadow of that image, his behavior erratic and his demeanor increasingly unpredictable. Rowan felt a wave of anger and confusion. How could he have hidden this from her? What else hadn't he told her? The evening ended in strained silence. Rowan returned to their suite alone, Declan claiming he needed air. She sat on the bed, staring at the neatly packed suitcases and the small reminders of their new life together. The sense of betrayal weighed heavily on her. This was supposed to be the beginning of their journey as a couple, a time for celebration and joy. Instead, she was faced with a reality she hadn't anticipated: a husband who was slipping into behaviors she didn't understand, carrying secrets she wasn't sure she could forgive. Rowan spent the night tossing and turning, unable to find rest. She thought of the promises they had made to each other just weeks ago, the vows of honesty and partnership. The man who had stood beside her at the altar now felt like a stranger, his actions unrecognizable. Her mind raced with questions. Had he been using before their wedding? Was this why his mood had shifted so abruptly in the days leading up to the trip? And most importantly, what would she do now? As dawn broke, Rowan resolved to confront him. She couldn't ignore the signs any longer, nor could she pretend that everything was fine. The silence between them had become deafening, and she knew it was only a matter of time before it gave way to something far more dangerous. The perfect honeymoon she had envisioned was gone, replaced by a growing darkness she couldn't yet fully comprehend. Unbeknownst to Rowan, the confrontation she was preparing for would set into motion a chain of events that would end in tragedy. The cracks in their relationship were no longer just fractures. They were fault lines, ready to rupture with devastating force. Rowan's intuition was right. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong, but the answers she sought would come at a price she could never have anticipated. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the cabin's balcony doors, casting an eerie glow over the rumpled bed where Rowan had spent a sleepless night. She rose quietly, her heart heavy but resolute. The events of the previous day had solidified her resolve. She needed answers, and she needed them now. There was no escaping the truth anymore. Declan's erratic behavior, his frequent absences, and the unshakable feeling that she no longer knew the man she had married had left her with no choice but to confront him. Declan was still asleep, sprawled across the bed with an arm thrown over his face. His breathing was uneven, his expression restless even in sleep. Rowan hesitated for a moment, watching him as a wave of conflicting emotions washed over her. She loved this man, at least she thought she did, but the person before her seemed like a stranger, his secrets carving a chasm between them that she couldn't bridge. Taking a deep breath, Rowan reached for the pouch she had seen Declan with the night before. It was tucked into the side pocket of his travel bag, just as she had suspected. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing its contents, a small plastic bag filled with white powder and a disposable lighter. Her stomach turned, the confirmation hitting her like a physical blow. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. Declan was using drugs, and he had been hiding it from her. A rustling sound behind her made Rowan's heart leap into her throat. Declan was awake, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto the pouch in her hands. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was heavy with unspoken words, the weight of the discovery hanging over them like a storm cloud. Then Declan bolted upright, his face contorted in a mixture of anger and panic. "What is this?" Rowan demanded, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed. Declan's jaw tightened, and she could see the gears turning in his mind as he scrambled for an explanation. But no excuse could erase the evidence in her hands. She pressed forward, her voice rising with each word. "How long, Declan? How long have you been doing this? And how could you not tell me?" Declan stood abruptly, towering over her as his expression darkened. His usual charm, the disarming smile he had so often used to diffuse tension, was gone. In its place was something cold, something that made Rowan's stomach twist with unease. "You don't understand," he said finally, his tone low and clipped. "It's not what you think." But it was exactly what she thought, and they both knew it. Rowan stepped back, clutching the pouch like a shield. "You lied to me," she said, her voice breaking. "You stood there and made vows, and all the while you were hiding this from me. What else are you hiding, Declan?" Her words seemed to ignite something in him, a spark that quickly became a blaze. Declan's expression twisted into something unrecognizable, his calm veneer cracking under the pressure. His movements became erratic, his breathing ragged. Rowan realized too late that she had cornered him, and that cornered animals were always the most dangerous. The next moments unfolded in a blur. Declan lunged for the pouch, his hand striking hers with more force than she expected. The impact sent her stumbling backward, her head hitting the edge of the dresser with a sickening thud. Pain exploded in her skull, but there was no time to recover. Declan was on her, his face a mask of desperation and fury. He wasn't thinking anymore. He was reacting, his actions driven by panic and the haze of whatever substance coursed through his veins. Rowan tried to push him away, but his strength overwhelmed her. Her mind raced as she struggled against him, searching for an escape. Her hand found the edge of the nightstand, and her fingers closed around the base of a heavy glass lamp. With all the strength she could muster, she swung it upward, striking Declan's shoulder and sending him reeling. For a moment, Rowan thought she had gained the upper hand. Declan staggered back, clutching his shoulder, his expression wild, but the reprieve was short-lived. His eyes fell on a bottle of wine sitting on the dresser, and without hesitation, he grabbed it. The bottle shattered as he brought it down on the edge of the table, creating a jagged weapon. The sight sent a jolt of fear through Rowan, but there was no time to react. Declan advanced on her, his movements unsteady but determined. Rowan scrambled backward, her mind screaming for her to run, to fight, to do anything to survive. The sound of shattering glass and Declan's heavy breathing filled the room, drowning out her own panicked thoughts. She reached for the door, but Declan was faster. His hand closed around her wrist, pulling her back with a force that sent her crashing to the floor. The last thing Rowan saw was the jagged edge of the bottle coming down toward her, the reflection of her own terror mirrored in the shards of glass. Pain erupted in her side, and then everything went dark. When the cabin fell silent, Declan stood over her motionless body, his chest heaving, as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. Blood pooled around Rowan, staining the pristine carpet and soaking into his shoes. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, but there was no time for regret. He had to act quickly. The ship would dock in the Bahamas within hours, and he needed to ensure there was no evidence left behind. Declan worked with a cold efficiency, driven by adrenaline and fear. He wrapped Rowan's body in the bedspread, his mind racing as he dragged her toward the service hatch he had scouted days earlier. He told himself it wasn't his fault, that she had pushed him too far, that the drugs weren't to blame. But no amount of justification could erase the blood on his hands. As he disposed of her body, the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, bathing the ocean in shades of gold and pink. For the other passengers aboard the Emerald Horizon, it was the start of another beautiful day in paradise. But for Rowan Callahan, it was the end of everything. And for Declan Pierce, it was only the beginning of his nightmare. The stillness of the early morning aboard the Emerald Horizon masked the violent storm that had erupted within its walls only hours earlier. Passengers leisurely moved about the ship, sipping coffee on sunlit decks and preparing for excursions in the Bahamas. Declan Pierce blended into this crowd, his face carefully neutral despite the storm of adrenaline and dread raging within him. The aftermath of what he had done felt surreal, as if the events of the night existed in a separate reality from the polished serenity of the cruise. Declan had spent the early hours meticulously cleaning the cabin, removing every visible trace of what had occurred. The wine bottle, shattered into jagged shards, was swept into a plastic bag and discarded in a garbage chute far from their suite. He scrubbed the blood from the bathroom floor, ensuring the tiles gleamed as though nothing had stained them. The bedspread, now missing from the bed, was a deliberate omission. Declan had used it to wrap Rowan's body before disposing of her in the engine maintenance area. He assured himself that the noise of the ship's machinery would drown out any sound of her body being dragged across the metal catwalks. Despite his efforts, paranoia began to creep in. He replayed every step in his mind, searching for anything he might have overlooked. The cabin door's lock hadn't been tampered with, the security cameras in the hall didn't cover the interior of their suite, and the staff would have no reason to suspect foul play. To anyone else, Rowan's absence would appear voluntary. Perhaps she had disembarked early for an excursion or chosen to spend the morning alone. It was a delicate narrative, and Declan knew he had to uphold it with careful precision. However, he couldn't account for the small details that slipped through the cracks. The faint blood stain beneath the base of the bed that his frantic scrubbing hadn't reached. The broken strand of Rowan's pearl bracelet lodged in the corner of the dresser. The scratches on his arms from Rowan's desperate struggle, now partially concealed by long sleeves, but raw and visible to anyone who looked closely. These were the silent witnesses to his crime, and they clung to him like shadows, impossible to fully erase. By mid-morning, Declan forced himself to join the other passengers on the main deck, hoping his presence would deflect suspicion. He avoided eye contact, kept his movements deliberate, and even forced himself to order a drink at the bar to maintain appearances. The staff greeted him with the same warmth they extended to every guest, oblivious to the dark secret he carried. But Declan felt every glance linger too long, every casual smile tinged with hidden judgment. He couldn't shake the sense that someone, somewhere, already knew. His unease was warranted. Below deck, in the maintenance area near the engine room, a crew member was about to make a discovery that would send shockwaves through the ship. During routine inspections, a mechanic noticed the bedspread tangled in the machinery. At first, he thought it was simply misplaced laundry, but as he drew closer, the dark red stains on the fabric caught his attention. He hesitated, his instincts telling him this was no ordinary accident. Pulling the fabric free, he uncovered a gruesome sight. Rowan's lifeless body, her face pale and bloodied, her broken pearls tangled in her hair. The mechanic's reaction was immediate. He radioed the ship's security team, who quickly secured the area and notified the captain. Within minutes, the discovery reached the ears of senior staff, who worked to contain the situation without alarming the passengers. The cruise line had strict protocols for such incidents, but this was no typical accident. The evidence of violence, bloodied fabric, visible bruises and lacerations, left no doubt that Rowan's death was the result of foul play. While the crew scrambled to manage the fallout, Declan remained unaware that his carefully constructed cover was beginning to crumble. His paranoia deepened as the morning wore on. The ship's atmosphere, once vibrant and carefree, now seemed heavy with unspoken tension. He noticed subtle changes, the hushed conversations among staff, the increased presence of security personnel patrolling the decks. Every sound, every movement felt amplified, a signal that his crime had already been uncovered. By the time the captain's announcement came over the ship's intercom, Declan's worst fears were confirmed. The captain informed passengers of a medical emergency involving one of the guests and asked everyone to remain calm as the crew worked with authorities. The language was vague, deliberately so, but Declan knew what it meant. Rowan had been found, and the carefully managed narrative he had crafted was unraveling before his eyes. Panic began to seep into Declan's mind. He retreated to his cabin, locking the door behind him as he tried to formulate his next move. The plan had been simple: dispose of Rowan's body, eliminate any evidence, and feign ignorance of her whereabouts. But now, the pieces were falling apart. The discovery of her body would bring investigators aboard, and Declan knew it was only a matter of time before the cracks in his alibi were exposed. As the ship neared the port in Nassau, the Bahamian authorities were already preparing to board. Declan felt the walls closing in around him. He told himself he could still control the narrative, that he could talk his way out of suspicion. But deep down he knew the truth. The evidence he thought he had hidden was still there, waiting to betray him. And as the ship's engines slowed and the shoreline came into view, Declan realized there was no escape from the nightmare he had created. What began as a perfect honeymoon had descended into chaos, and now every step he took would be a race against the inevitable. Rowan's death was no longer a secret. It was a puzzle waiting to be solved, and Declan was the piece that didn't fit. The ship docked in Nassau under a veil of unease. Passengers gathered on the upper decks, eager to disembark for their excursions, oblivious to the mounting crisis unfolding below. Declan Pierce, however, felt every minute stretch into eternity as he remained confined to his cabin, trying to suppress the rising panic clawing at his chest. The Bahamian authorities and ship security had boarded discreetly, but their presence was unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Declan knew the clock was ticking. He had spent the hours since the captain's announcement reviewing every detail of his actions, searching for missteps. His mind looped through the night before, the hurried disposal of Rowan's body, the cleaning, the facade he'd tried to maintain. He clung to the hope that his calculated composure would protect him, that the growing web of suspicion wouldn't ensnare him. But deep down, he couldn't ignore the weight of what he had done. The knock on his cabin door came sooner than he had anticipated. It wasn't loud or aggressive, just a measured series of raps. Declan's heart hammered in his chest as he approached the door, each step heavy with dread. On the other side stood a uniformed member of the ship's security team, flanked by two Bahamian officers. Their expressions were neutral, but their presence left no room for interpretation. Declan forced a polite smile, feigning confusion, as the lead officer informed him that they needed to ask him a few questions about his wife's whereabouts. Declan nodded, his exterior calm, even as his insides churned. He followed them through the winding corridors of the ship, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent halls. Other passengers had been directed to remain in public areas, and the ship felt eerily empty. Every turn brought Declan closer to the reality he was desperately trying to avoid. He rehearsed his story in his mind, clinging to the idea that he could still talk his way out of this. In the security office, Declan was seated at a plain metal table under the watchful eyes of the authorities. Detective Fiona McAllister, a seasoned investigator from Miami who had been flown in to assist with the case, observed him closely. She had been briefed on the discovery of Rowan's body and the preliminary evidence pointing to foul play. Her experience told her that Declan's calm demeanor was a mask, one she intended to dismantle piece by piece. The questioning began innocuously. Declan recounted the last time he had seen Rowan, claiming she had left their cabin late at night to stargaze. He described her as adventurous and independent, subtly framing her absence as something voluntary rather than suspicious. But as the questions turned toward specifics, the timeline of his actions, his whereabouts during the night, and the scratches on his arms, Declan began to falter. McAllister's approach was methodical. She didn't accuse him outright, but instead allowed the inconsistencies in his story to surface naturally. Every hesitation, every slip of detail was cataloged, each one chipping away at the facade Declan had constructed. The scratches on his arms became a focal point, as did the faint bloodstains on the cuff of his sleeve that he had failed to notice in his panic. Meanwhile, forensic investigators were piecing together the evidence from the crime scene. Rowan's body, though badly damaged, bore clear signs of a violent struggle. Lacerations consistent with a glass weapon were found on her torso and arms, and her skull showed evidence of blunt force trauma. The blood spatter patterns in the couple's cabin indicated a sudden and brutal altercation, contradicting Declan's account of her simply leaving the room. Security footage from the ship provided additional damning evidence. Though the cameras didn't capture the inside of the cabin, They showed Declan dragging a large, blanket-covered object through the corridor toward the service hatch. The footage confirmed the timeline investigators had begun to establish, placing Declan at the center of the crime. As the evidence mounted, Declan's confidence began to erode. The controlled persona he had maintained during the initial questioning gave way to visible cracks. His answers became evasive, his composure slipping with each pointed question. Detective McAllister pressed harder, her tone remaining calm but firm as she confronted him with the inconsistencies in his story. Declan attempted to pivot, suggesting that Rowan's injuries could have been accidental. Perhaps she had tripped, or perhaps someone else had attacked her after she left their cabin. But the evidence left little room for doubt. The forensic findings, the security footage, and the scratches on his arms all pointed to one conclusion. Rowan's death was no accident, and Declan had been the last person to see her alive. By the time the interview concluded, Declan's once confident demeanor had been reduced to a shadow of itself. He was escorted back to his cabin, ostensibly still a person of interest, rather than a formal suspect. But he knew the walls were closing in. The authorities would continue to uncover more evidence, each piece tightening the noose around his neck. His carefully crafted narrative was crumbling, and with it, any hope of escape. As the day wore on, Declan remained confined to his cabin, his mind racing with desperation. He considered his options, but they all led to the same inevitable conclusion. The evidence was too strong, the witnesses too credible, the truth too damning. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and now he would have to face the consequences. For the rest of the passengers aboard the Emerald Horizon, the day unfolded like any other. They explored the vibrant streets of Nassau, lounged by the ship's pool, and enjoyed the lavish amenities the cruise had to offer. But beneath the surface of the ship's polished exterior, a grim reality was taking shape. Rowan Callahan's death was no longer a mystery. It was a murder, and the man responsible was running out of places to hide. By the time the Emerald Horizon departed Nassau, the investigation had shifted into high gear. The Bahamian authorities, in collaboration with Detective Fiona McAllister, had amassed a mounting pile of evidence that pointed directly to Declan Pierce. What had begun as an inquiry into a missing passenger had quickly evolved into a full-scale murder investigation, and the scope of Declan's lies was beginning to unravel. While Declan remained confined to his cabin under close surveillance, the forensic team continued combing through the evidence. Rowan Callahan's injuries painted a chilling picture of the violence she had endured. Blunt force trauma to her skull, lacerations on her arms and torso, and defensive wounds on her hands indicated a desperate struggle. The bloodstains found in the cabin, initially scrubbed in haste, had seeped into the carpet and baseboards, betraying Declan's frantic attempts to erase the scene of his crime. The ship's maintenance logs added another piece to the puzzle. The bedspread used to conceal Rowan's body had jammed part of the engine machinery, triggering an alert in the early hours of the morning. The crew member who investigated the issue had unknowingly witnessed Declan disposing of the body, later corroborating this timeline when shown security footage of the corridor leading to the engine room. Every detail reinforced Declan's culpability, leaving little room for doubt. As the evidence piled up, so did the pressure on Declan. Detective McAllister reviewed the findings with methodical precision, each new discovery deepening her understanding of the events that had transpired. She knew Declan was teetering on the edge, his bravado steadily eroding as the weight of his actions closed in around him. All she needed was a crack in his defenses, a single misstep that would shatter his carefully constructed facade. Declan's undoing came in the form of a torn piece of paper discovered in the couple's cabin. Tucked beneath the nightstand, it bore Rowan's handwriting, a note written in a hurried, uneven scrawl. Though partially destroyed, enough of the message remained to reveal her growing fear. "I can't ignore it anymore. The drugs, the lies, I need to leave before—" The remainder of the note was illegible, but its implication was clear. Rowan had planned to confront Declan and leave him, a decision that likely sealed her fate. The note, combined with witness testimony, further cemented the narrative. The bartender recalled Rowan leaving dinner early the night of her death, her face pale and her demeanor tense. A housekeeper reported finding traces of drug paraphernalia in the cabin days earlier, though she had initially dismissed it as unremarkable. Each detail added another thread to the web of evidence, tightening around Declan with every passing hour. When McAllister confronted Declan with the note, his response was predictably defensive. He denied its significance, claiming Rowan had misunderstood him and that her fears were unfounded. But his increasingly erratic behavior betrayed him. He shifted in his seat, his hands clenched into fists, and his eyes darted toward the door, as though searching for an escape. McAllister knew she had him cornered. The final blow came when forensic experts analyzed the shards of the broken wine bottle recovered from the crime scene. Microscopic traces of blood and hair matched Rowan's DNA, confirming it as the weapon used in the attack. The jagged edges of the bottle perfectly aligned with the lacerations on her body, leaving no doubt as to how she had been killed. It was a piece of evidence Declan couldn't explain away, no matter how carefully he tried to spin his story. As McAllister laid out the evidence during their next interview, Declan's composure finally shattered. His breathing grew labored, his voice rising as he attempted to deflect blame. He rambled about Rowan's supposed overreaction to his drug use, insisting that she had provoked him by threatening to leave. But McAllister wasn't swayed. Her calm, measured demeanor only heightened his agitation, pushing him closer to the breaking point. When Declan's confession came, it was as chaotic and fragmented as the crime itself. He admitted to the argument, to grabbing the wine bottle in a moment of rage, and to striking Rowan when she tried to leave. He claimed he hadn't meant to kill her, that it was the drugs clouding his judgment, but the details of his actions betrayed his intent. The decision to clean the cabin, the disposal of her body, and the deliberate efforts to mislead investigators were not the actions of a man overcome by a momentary lapse. They were the calculated moves of someone determined to escape justice. With his confession secured, the case against Declan was complete. The authorities wasted no time formally arresting him, escorting him off the Emerald Horizon in handcuffs as the ship returned to Miami. The other passengers, initially unaware of the gravity of the situation, watched in stunned silence as the news spread. The once celebrated honeymoon couple had become the center of a gruesome tragedy, a dark shadow cast over the ship's opulent facade. For Rowan's family, the news of her death was a devastating blow. Her parents, who had eagerly awaited updates from their daughter's honeymoon, were instead faced with the unbearable reality that she was never coming home. Friends and colleagues in Charleston mourned the loss of a bright, compassionate woman whose life had been cut short by senseless violence. The community, once united in celebrating Rowan's marriage, now rallied together in grief and disbelief. As the investigation concluded and the legal process began, the spotlight shifted to the broader implications of the case. The Emerald Horizon implemented stricter security protocols, including enhanced surveillance in private corridors and more thorough background checks for passengers. Rowan's death became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the dangers that could lurk beneath even the most idyllic surface. For Declan, there was no escape. His fate was sealed, his actions laid bare for the world to see. The perfect honeymoon he had envisioned had devolved into a nightmare, and now he would face the full weight of justice. But for Rowan, there would be no justice that could undo the tragedy, no resolution that could erase the pain her loved ones carried. Her life, full of promise and purpose, had been stolen in an instant, leaving behind a legacy defined by both light and shadow. The courtroom was packed as the trial of Declan Pierce began, drawing national attention for its shocking brutality and chilling details. Media outlets dubbed it the honeymoon murder, a phrase that sent shivers through those following the case. For Rowan Callahan's family, the trial was not just a quest for justice, but also a painful reopening of wounds that had barely begun to heal. Prosecutors wasted no time painting a vivid picture of Declan as a manipulative man who had concealed his drug addiction, leading to a horrific act of violence. The opening statements laid out the evidence in stark detail: the blood-stained cabin, the forensic analysis of the wine bottle, the scratches on Declan's arms, and most damning of all, his confession. Every detail was presented with precision, leaving no room for ambiguity about the sequence of events that led to Rowan's death. The prosecution's case rested heavily on forensic evidence, which told the story of what had happened in that cabin far more reliably than Declan's fragmented confession. The blood spatter patterns on the walls and carpet were analyzed to show the trajectory of the attack, while the shards of the wine bottle bore traces of both Declan's fingerprints and Rowan's blood. Rowan's injuries, documented in autopsy photos, corroborated the violent nature of her death, with deep lacerations and blunt force trauma marking the culmination of a desperate struggle. The torn note found in the cabin became a key piece of evidence, revealing Rowan's growing fear of Declan's erratic behavior. Although incomplete, it painted a chilling picture of her realization that the man she had married was not who he appeared to be. Prosecutors framed the note as the catalyst for the argument that ended her life, suggesting that Rowan's decision to confront Declan about his drug use and leave him had triggered his violent outburst. Witness testimony further bolstered the prosecution's narrative. A bartender recounted Rowan's visible distress during dinner on the night of her death, describing her as unusually quiet and withdrawn. A housekeeper testified about discovering drug paraphernalia in the couple's cabin earlier in the trip, an observation she initially dismissed, but later recognized as a crucial piece of the puzzle. The maintenance worker who found Rowan's body described the moment of discovery in harrowing detail, his account underscoring the brutality of her final moments. Declan's defense attempted to reframe the narrative, portraying him as a man whose actions were the result of impaired judgment caused by substance abuse. They argued that his addiction had clouded his decision-making, leading to an unintentional act of violence rather than premeditated murder. They presented Declan as a victim of his circumstances, a man who had spiraled into addiction and made a tragic mistake. But this argument rang hollow against the overwhelming evidence of his calculated efforts to clean the crime scene and dispose of Rowan's body. The prosecution dismantled the defense's narrative piece by piece. They highlighted the deliberate nature of Declan's actions after the murder, emphasizing the methodical steps he took to cover his tracks. From scrubbing the cabin to dragging Rowan's body through the ship to the service hatch, every detail underscored his intent to conceal the crime rather than face the consequences. The confession, while chaotic and self-serving, was framed as an admission of guilt, further solidifying the case against him. As the trial progressed, Rowan's parents sat stoically in the front row, their grief etched into their faces. They had been warned about the graphic nature of the evidence, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of hearing their daughter's final moments dissected in court. The images of the blood-stained cabin, the forensic analysis of her injuries, and the timeline of her last hours were almost too much to bear. Yet they remained, determined to honor Rowan's memory and see justice served. The trial reached its climax when the prosecution presented the security footage from the Emerald Horizon. The grainy black and white images showed Declan dragging a large blanket-covered object through the corridor toward the maintenance area. Although the footage did not capture the actual disposal of Rowan's body, it provided a chilling visual of Declan's actions after the murder. The sight of him moving with such deliberate purpose left an indelible impression on the jury, a stark contrast to the image of him as a remorseful man struggling with addiction. When the closing arguments were delivered, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The prosecution reiterated the evidence, urging the jury to focus on the calculated steps Declan took to conceal his crime. They emphasized Rowan's vulnerability, her trust in a man who had betrayed her in the most horrific way imaginable. The defense, in contrast, pleaded for leniency, asking the jury to consider Declan's impaired state of mind and the role his addiction had played in the tragedy. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When they returned with their verdict, the courtroom fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Declan Pierce was found guilty of second-degree murder, a charge that carried the possibility of life in prison without parole. The judge, noting the brutality of the crime and the deliberate steps taken to cover it up, handed down the maximum sentence, ensuring that Declan would spend the rest of his life behind bars. For Rowan's family, the verdict was bittersweet. It brought a sense of closure, but no punishment could ever bring their daughter back. The trial had revealed the depths of Declan's deception and the magnitude of his betrayal, leaving them to grapple with the haunting question of whether Rowan's life could have been saved if she had seen the warning signs sooner. As the media frenzy surrounding the trial began to subside, the Callahans turned their attention to preserving Rowan's legacy. They established the Callahan Initiative, a foundation dedicated to raising awareness about domestic violence and substance abuse, ensuring that her death would not be in vain. The tragedy aboard the Emerald Horizon would forever be etched into the public consciousness, a stark reminder of the dangers hidden beneath even the most idyllic surfaces. Rowan's story, though tragic, became a beacon for change, inspiring conversations about addiction, violence, and the importance of recognizing the red flags in relationships. For those who loved her, it was a small but meaningful way to ensure that her life, though cut short, would continue to make an impact. The echoes of Rowan Callahan's tragic death reverberated far beyond the emerald horizon. Her story became a haunting reminder of how hidden struggles, unchecked addiction, and unspoken violence could shatter lives and destroy trust. In the months following the trial, the focus shifted from Declan Pierce's crime to the broader implications of what had occurred, a call to action against the insidious dangers of drug abuse and its devastating ripple effects. Rowan's family, despite their grief, channeled their pain into advocacy. The Callahan Initiative, established shortly after Declan's conviction, became a driving force in raising awareness about the dangers of addiction and the warning signs of abusive behavior in relationships. They partnered with national organizations to fund educational programs, host community events, and provide resources for individuals and families affected by addiction. Rowan's parents, once quiet figures in the Charleston community, emerged as powerful voices for change, sharing their daughter's story to prevent others from facing the same heartbreak. The media attention surrounding the case amplified their efforts. Documentaries, podcasts, and news specials dissected the events leading to Rowan's death, shedding light on the societal issues at play. Experts weighed in on the psychological and physiological effects of drug abuse, highlighting how substances like cocaine, believed to be Declan's drug of choice, could impair judgment, heighten aggression, and lead to catastrophic consequences. Stories of others who had lost loved ones to addiction poured in, creating a collective narrative that underscored the urgent need for intervention and education. One of the most poignant aspects of the initiative's work was its focus on prevention. Workshops in schools and community centers emphasized the early warning signs of substance abuse and the dangers of enabling destructive behaviors. Rowan's story was integrated into these programs, presented not as a sensational crime, but as a cautionary tale of how addiction could escalate into irreversible tragedy. Participants were encouraged to recognize red flags in their own lives and to seek help for themselves or their loved ones before it was too late. In Charleston, Rowan's legacy took on a deeply personal significance. A scholarship fund in her name was established to support students pursuing careers in marine biology, ensuring that her passion for the ocean would live on. The local aquarium dedicated a section of its exhibits to her memory, using her story to educate visitors about the interconnectedness of human actions and the environment. Rowan's vibrant spirit became a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder of the beauty and fragility of life. The cruise industry, too, faced scrutiny in the wake of the tragedy. The Emerald Horizon and its parent company implemented sweeping changes to their policies, including enhanced training for staff to identify signs of drug abuse and violence among passengers. Security measures were tightened, with increased surveillance in common areas and private corridors, as well as stricter protocols for handling medical and security emergencies. These changes, though reactive, set a new standard for passenger safety, spurred by the widespread outcry following Rowan's death. For Declan Pierce, the consequences of his actions extended far beyond his life sentence. His name became synonymous with betrayal and violence, a cautionary figure in discussions about the destructive power of addiction. In prison, he was enrolled in mandatory substance abuse programs, though the damage he had wrought could never be undone. His attempts to appeal his conviction were swiftly denied, leaving him to confront the weight of his choices in isolation. The broader societal impact of Rowan's story lay in its ability to bridge gaps in understanding. It shed light on the complex interplay between addiction, mental health, and interpersonal violence, urging communities to address these issues with empathy and urgency. Advocacy groups used her case to push for increased funding for addiction treatment programs and domestic violence shelters, recognizing that early intervention could save lives. Policymakers, inspired by the public outcry, introduced legislation aimed at improving access to mental health and substance abuse resources, as well as stricter regulations for the cruise industry. Perhaps the most profound effect of Rowan's story was its ability to ignite conversations about the stigma surrounding addiction. Declan's descent into drug use and its deadly consequences underscored the need to approach addiction as a public health crisis rather than a moral failing. Communities across the country began hosting forums and support groups, creating safe spaces for individuals to seek help without fear of judgment. Rowan's name became a rallying cry for compassion, her memory a testament to the importance of addressing addiction with urgency and care. For Rowan's loved ones, the years that followed were marked by both sorrow and resilience. Her parents found solace in their advocacy work, drawing strength from the lives they touched through the Callahan Initiative. Her friends, many of whom had witnessed the cracks in Declan's facade too late, channeled their guilt into action, becoming vocal advocates for relationship safety and substance abuse awareness. Together, they created a legacy that honored Rowan's life while transforming her death into a force for good. As time passed, Rowan's story became a touchstone for a generation grappling with the realities of addiction and violence. It served as a reminder that beneath the surface of even the most picturesque lives could lie hidden dangers, and that vigilance, education, and compassion were essential tools in preventing such tragedies. In the end, Rowan's life, though cut short, became a catalyst for change, a beacon of light in the darkness she had left behind. Her legacy was not defined by the circumstances of her death, but by the impact of her story and the lessons it taught. Through the work of her family and countless others inspired by her memory, Rowan Callahan's voice continued to echo, urging the world to confront the shadows of addiction and violence with courage, understanding, and hope. The story has been edited to ensure personal privacy and security regarding names and locations. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe to see the latest and most thrilling family crime stories.